Hello everyone, it is Michelle aka Chat-Mort here, and as you can see, there is no face cam today, just a cute little MS Paint version of me, so enjoy that visual if you are so compelled. I wanted to discuss an article that I read on the Blaze website, which is the website for Glenn Beck's network/radio station. And one of the writers he has do a lot of opinion pieces on the Blaze is a guy named Matt Walsh. Now, I really do like Matt Walsh. I admire him a lot. He tends to write in a very, I don't want to say incendiary style, but he doesn't mince words, and it's very clearly things from his opinion. He does not sugarcoat anything or make any efforts to avoid offending anyone or, avoid inciting any kind of disagreement. Matt Walsh tends to write articles from a very, religious, Christian conservative perspective, which is something that to an extent I can relate to, but not a whole lot. Overall, I really appreciate his commentary, and I think that a lot of his points are valid, or at least thought-provoking. This is an article of his that I came across titled 5 Reasons Why Living Together Before Marriage Will Kill Your Relationship. And as I will state again at the end of this video, I do more or less agree with the sentiment that cohabitating or shacking up, if you will, can be a threat to later on, actual marriage type commitment. But I disagree with pretty much all of the reasoning he gives in this article, and that's specifically what I wanted to go over here. So I will read you guys his article, and I will go through point by point why I disagree with the reasoning for him coming out with this stance. I do really respect him, and I hope that this doesn't get conveyed too much as me being mad at him or taking jabs at him. I just think that he's fairly intellectual. I mean, you can tell that he's very bright and definitely has a valuable perspective and voice. And this article, in my opinion, does not live up to, I guess, my expectations for him as such a cerebral and well-spoken guy and journalist. I will also include the link to this article in the description, so if you want to read it yourself, which I highly encourage, you can do that from here. It's often said that living together before marriage is a good way to practice. Oddly though, as more and more Americans practice marriage in this way, fewer and fewer Americans are actually getting married. It seems everyone is practicing, but nobody is playing. And if the cohabiting couple ever does tie the knot, studies have repeatedly shown that their chances of divorce have only increased. This is a very strange sort of practice indeed. It appears that cohabitation is more likely to be divorce practice than marriage practice. But why? I think that there are 5 reasons, at least. 1. There is no commitment. How can you practice committing to someone by not committing to them? You either commit or you don't. There is no halfway point. Marriage is marriage because of the eternal promise you make to your beloved. Mere cohabitation is mere cohabitation precisely because you declined to make that promise. You can't practice the undying devotion of marriage by taking on a roommate any more than you can practice parenthood by adopting a parakeet or buying a houseplant. It's one of those all-or-nothing propositions. Already, you are intentionally misconstruing the reasoning of living together before marriage. Nobody recommending this practice is arguing that you can practice the undying devotion of marriage. The argument is that you are practicing cohabitation, which is a major component of marriage. People often say that getting married without cohabitation is like buying a vehicle you haven't taken on a test drive. Well, it seems weird to compare your betrothed to a Toyota Corolla, but alright, let's go with this extraordinarily inadequate metaphor. If marriage is a car, then commitment is the engine. It's the thing that propels the marriage, gives it life, defines it, makes it worth something. So, test driving this particular automobile is like whipping the wheel back and forth in a vehicle with no engine. It may be a fun way to let off some steam, but you aren't going anywhere, you aren't doing anything, and you certainly aren't learning what it's like to actually drive on the highway. Wait, so spending days and nights together, discussing and executing financial decisions, eating together, running errands together, making a home together, and addressing social, spiritual, and work-related issues together aren't learning how to be married? Because whether you perform these actions before or after the wedding ceremony, you are learning how marriage works through experience. It's not enough to say that cohabitation is different from marriage. The truth is that it's the direct opposite of marriage. In marriage, you live as one, united through sickness and health until death do you part. In cohabitation, you live as two divided for an undetermined period of time, for as long as it remains convenient until one or both of you decides otherwise. You may point out that many modern marriages function more like the latter than the former, and I'd agree. That's the point. Cohabitation doesn't resemble marriage, but in our culture, marriage increasingly resembles cohabitation. If in our culture, marriage increasingly resembles cohabitation, you're arguing that marriage is becoming more like a lack of commitment. That doesn't reinforce the argument you're trying to make, that a lack of commitment is a threat to marriage later. Couples inevitably bring the cohabitating mindset into marriage because it's hard to flip the switch, especially when your married life looks on the surface almost exactly like your life before. You leave the wedding reception and return to the apartment you already shared and the lives that were already intertwined in every practical way. The only difference, and it's a huge one, a defining one, is that now you've made a lifelong commitment to one another. So the fanfare, expenses, decorum, and superficiality that is a wedding ceremony is the transformative event that makes your relationship with your life partner worth investing yourself entirely in. Why weren't the other milestones in your relationship steps in becoming a committed, stronger couple? Were your cooperation, communication, planning, and your endeavors together prior impractical and insincere due solely to the fact that they occurred before your wedding day? This implies that you aren't at all serious or committed until the ceremony itself takes place, which, as someone who thinks that you should conduct yourself with sincerity and honesty in all things, especially romantic relationships, is deeply worrying. But that's not what you've practiced. You haven't practiced commitment, you've practiced avoiding it. You've practiced living with this person tenuously and conditionally, and whether you intend to or not, there's a good chance you'll continue on living exactly as you rehearsed. This is an inaccurate generalization. Many couples are not avoiding commitment, but have committed in ways that are either strictly religious or don't relate to religion at all. Many couples get married after moving in together in order to stay on their parents' insurance or to otherwise maintain their current financial circumstances, or get married after saving up enough money to have a ceremony as opposed to going into debt. You are injecting your own assumption of motivations into tens of thousands of cohabitation relationships. 2. Cohabitating puts the emphasis on the wrong things. The most hilarious justification offered for cohabitation is that you need to make sure your partner has no annoying or gross habits. This is kind of like saying you need to jump in the ocean to make sure it isn't too moist. Everyone has annoying and gross habits. It's part of being a person. The only way to ensure that your partner has no irritating tendencies is to marry someone in a coma. This is an admitted decision to single out what you find to be the most illogical reason to cohabitate, so you can make more generalizations, and so you have an easy argument to refute. You're effectively admitting in the first half of the first sentence that you aren't attempting to critically analyze this practice with any practical refutations. You picked low-hanging fruit despite clearly comprehending that it doesn't represent the majority of couples who choose to live together unmarried. As for conscious human beings, there is no mystery. This is especially important for women to understand. Ladies, no reason to speculate here. Yes, your boyfriend is a pig and he would live in utter filth and disarray if left to his own devices. My apartment resembled an abandoned refugee camp when I was single. My bathroom was the stuff of nightmares. My kitchen looked like a nuclear testing site, even though I only used it to cook twice in 5 years. I'm not a homemaker, in other words. Few men are. You don't need to live with them before marriage to investigate the matter. This is just a fact of life, and you're either prepared to deal with it or not. You either love your man enough to cope with it, or you don't. The insinuation that the only thing you need to determine about your significant other is how adept a homemaker he is absurd. Human beings are more complex than gender stereotypes, and it should go without saying that no two relationships are of an identical dynamic. The human psyche is far more complicated than being messy or not being messy, being private about bodily functions or not being private about them. Humans are raised in an incomprehensible variety of households, some an only child, some with a dozen siblings, some with one parent, some with two. Some people disinfect the entire kitchen daily, while others have used measuring cups and coffee pots for decades without washing them. Some people need privacy to digest and reflect on what happened during the day, while others need near constant stimulus and interaction. There are people who toss and turn and make noise when they sleep, and there are people who will be woken up by the slightest sound and can't get back to sleep for the rest of the night. There are people who are comfortable in a house at 85 degrees Fahrenheit, and there are people like me who are so intolerant to heat that if it's above 70 degrees they have no appetite and can't sleep no matter how many days go by without it. Claiming that dealing with day-to-day incompatibilities is simply a matter of maturity is incorrect. But men aren't the only culprits. No person is easy to live with all the time. They all have their hang-ups, tics, and idiosyncrasies. They chew with their mouth open or leave wet towels on the floor, or they always misplace their car keys, or they snore, or they have a habit of tripping while holding glasses filled with dark liquids and spilling said liquids all over various rugs and items of furniture, guilty, or they do a million other things that you wish they wouldn't, but they keep on doing. And so what? And so what? What if you're on an extremely tight budget and can't afford to throw away towels that get so mildewed that they're unsalvageable? What if your spouse is completely unwilling to do their dishes or even put them in the sink? You mixed things that are out of one's control, such as snoring and spilling things, and things like leaving used towels on the floor, which is completely within one's control. Do you leave messes all over your house, even accidental things like spilling Coke or a beer on the carpet, and when your wife brings them up, say, "So what?" Because if that's how you respond when confronted with the expectation that you act like an adult, I'm starting to see why it benefits you to have such a dismissive attitude toward the annoyances that occur when you're living with somebody. If you set out to discover those kinds of things before you get married, you've only sent the message that your marriage will be predicated on them. Okay, I'm marrying you because I've decided that you aren't too annoying or gross or inconvenient to have around, you say. But what happens after a few months of actual marriage when certain annoyances and inconveniences pop up? What happens when you realize that your marriage simulation failed? The results were faulty. You were duped. He's not perfect. He has flaws. He is a human being, it turns out. What now? I would argue that it's smart to discuss and investigate one another's potential idiosyncrasies and bad habits before you live together, not petty and pessimistic. You can't be a responsible, mature adult, let alone a viable participant in a marriage, if you dismiss any criticism of leaving wet towels on the floor as, "You were duped. I am a human being, it turns out." If my fiancé and I tried to use this excuse, not only would the other of us be deeply worried at how wrong we were at judging the willingness to actively contribute, we'd probably be kicked out of our apartment for destroying the wood flooring. You can't seriously expect the character flaws that you can't detect before living with somebody to be 100% excusable by acting like being displeased with them is immature, petty, and indicative of one's willingness, or lack thereof, to commit. Can I also point out that you're making excuses for husbands for some reason when there really isn't any correlation between gender and how organized and responsible someone is? I mean, it's certainly not because women being lazy or messy isn't part of your perception or expectations. I hope no man ever discovers that he's been duped by expecting his wife not to be lazy and disorganized, the poor dumbass. Irreconcilable differences, you tell the judge. He leaves the cap off the toothpaste and forgets to put the milk back in the fridge. So you're not taking the issue seriously at all. There are thought-provoking arguments you could have addressed and refuted, but instead you're intentionally using cases of blatant pettiness and irresponsibility to represent the whole of an issue you disagree with. That's fine. Journalistic integrity is incredibly rare these days. Just don't get upset when people don't take your commentary seriously, since you're clearly not attempting to start any real dialogue that could change people's minds. 3. Living together before marriage makes it too hard to leave. It should be easy to split up with someone you haven't married. I want to leave, but it's complicated, people often say, but it isn't complicated, or it shouldn't be. She isn't your wife. You aren't committed to her. Complicated? She's just your girlfriend. Call her up, tell her it's over, and move on. Complicated? You're just dating. There are no stakes in this. It doesn't matter. Where's the complication? Well, you're living together. You can't walk your separate ways without selling the condo and figuring out a custody arrangement for the dog. Suddenly, what should be a very simple and straightforward breakup is now some kind of mini-divorce, a divorce dress rehearsal. It shouldn't be this way. Think of that De Niro line from Heat. Don't let yourself get attached to anything that you are not willing to walk out on in 30 seconds flat if you feel the heat around the corner. That's a terrible way to operate in a marriage, but it's not a bad way to approach the dating scene, especially if you conduct elaborate bank heists for a living. If there's a good reason to abandon ship, a lack of trust or honesty, conflicting priorities in life, different values, etc., you ought to be in a position where you can just jump overboard immediately, needing only to stop by their place and pick up your phone charger as you swim to shore. So maybe not 30 seconds, but it shouldn't take more than 30 minutes or so to completely sever ties. If this isn't you being facetious to get your point across, this kind of callousness should have been a red flag to your wife. Then again, as you mentioned later on in this article, it's incorrect to court someone for long enough to really know who they are before getting married and moving in together, so there are a great many shacked up couples who are only together today because breaking up would be too much of a hassle. Some people live together for years under these circumstances. They have complications and entanglements of marriage without the commitment or the stability. It's the worst of all worlds. And then what happens? They stay together because it's too complicated to split, and then after a while they get hitched by default. This is an argument I actually partially agree with. You're actually addressing a common, measurable phenomenon that reflects the experiences of a lot of couples who are living together unmarried. The problem with your point is that this does not mean that a couple should get married sooner. It means that they should have waited longer before making the shift to being together under the same roof every day. Unless you're staying married for all the wrong reasons, such as perceptions of others, legal reasons, and fear of having to be self-reliant again, the issues causing a breakup are going to become a problem whether they are married yet or not. Many divorces and breakups would be prevented by people waiting until they truly know each other to make the commitment instead of rushing into things prematurely. I'm also puzzled because you refuse to acknowledge the step between dating and marriage. What about people who have committed to spend their lives together before God and their loved ones, but lack the paperwork to reflect that they've committed before the government? Why does engagement simply not exist in your arguments, where it would muddy the point you're making? Now they're married despite having grown tired of each other years ago. They're an old, weary married couple before they can even cut the cake. They've jettisoned right past their marriage's infancy and energetic youth and started in the middle of its midlife crisis. The marriage is new, but it has no novelty. The honeymoon wore off before it happened. Why do you think people these days complain of being bored in marriages after like 6 months? They got a head start on the boredom, and that's not a great way to begin a marriage. If boredom or growing tired of each other is a legitimate threat to your relationship in any stage, you should not be in romantic relationships, period. And while it's not necessarily a bad thing for the novelty of your marriage to enhance it, if it is in any way part of what is sustaining your marriage, as you characterized it here, you again should not be in relationships, period, let alone a lifelong commitment. 4. You can figure out everything you need to know about someone without living with them. Here are the things that we ought to ask ourselves about the person we're dating. Are they faithful? Are they honest? Do they have a good heart? Are they virtuous? Do they love God? Do they keep their promises? Do we have the same fundamental goals and priorities in life? That's all that really matters. First off, the idea that these criteria are exhaustive and universal is utterly wrong. The fact that these are your personal criteria in no way means that they are objectively the correct way to go about seeking out a mate. Many virtuous, God-loving individuals have different and far more specific criteria than yours. I saw all of that in my wife almost immediately. I don't understand how you could date a woman for months or even years and still be unsure about her qualities. Either you have the perceptiveness of a potato, or more likely you know everything you need to know but you're afraid to take the next step, whether that step is a breakup or an engagement ring. Then you're incredibly overconfident in your own psychic abilities, incredibly naive, or both. Basic psychology tells you that you can't truly know someone without having been around them consistently for at least 2 years. In several months, you can't determine whether someone is responsible, faithful, kind, honest in their intentions, capable of overcoming hardship and the normal fluctuations of life in a healthy way, and living consistently with their stated values. If you're being honest about seeing all of that in your wife immediately, you're both foolhardy and extremely lucky that what you thought you saw was accurate. You cannot apply what worked for you and declare that anything else implies that people are stupid or immoral and expect anyone to see you as empirically logical, let alone someone striving to be godly. This is a pretty reliable rule. If you've been with someone for a few months and you still have no idea whether he fits any of the criteria I listed above, he doesn't. Don't move in with him to get a closer look. Just leave. If he's not obviously honest, faithful, and good-hearted, he's probably not honest, faithful, and good-hearted at all. Okay, maybe he's a sociopath who can fool anyone into thinking he's Prince Charming while he carries on a double life as a mob hitman, but probably not. In most cases, it doesn't take long to assess the character of a person. If you need to sleep in a man's bed to see his virtue, he has none. You can pretend that this sophomoric black and white nonsense is applicable in the real world, but it isn't. 5. Cohabitation is modern. I'm not saying this is the most pressing reason to avoid cohabitation, but it is worth considering. Our grandparents didn't live together before marriage, and our grandparents were married for 65 years before they died. These days, cohabitation is ubiquitous, and we can't even make it 6.5 years before we're searching for a divorce attorney. Maybe our grandparents were onto something. Since we're making condescending, sweeping generalizations, our grandparents were brought up in a culture where you stayed together no matter how much adultery, abuse, and neglect you endured at the hands of your spouse. Is staying with someone who in no way honors the commitment they made to you in marriage more righteous than acknowledging their behaviors that are a forfeiture of that commitment? You're almost right when you state that this isn't the most pressing reason to avoid cohabitation. It is, in fact, not a valid reason whatsoever. The naive and dangerous romanticization of the past that you're engaging in contributes to a warped perception of reality that makes our predecessors' morality seem unattainable and the world today seem morally bankrupt beyond any redemption. Generally speaking, any bit of marriage wisdom that became popular in the 1960s or more recently should be ignored. Perhaps there's an exception, but I can't think of what it might be. Sure, husbands in those days may have been a little too emotionally distant. Wives may have been a little too limited in their options outside the home. But these days, husbands are effeminate crybabies, and wives will do just about anything to avoid raising their own kids. So it's hard for me to say that we've offered a valid correction in this regard or any other. You can't acknowledge that, sure, there were flaws to the cultural norm of marriage dynamics in the past, and then attempt to quantify any supposed corrections in a single sentence. This is especially true when you start out with what had the potential to be an excellent argument, and crash it into the ground with more flippant generalizations. We get it almost completely wrong. You could disregard everything that's been said about marriage in the last 50 years, and your marriage would be happier and sturdier because of it. Just look at how people today commonly operate in their romantic relationships, and do the opposite. Find the road with the fewest tire marks and drive down it. That's a good way to approach all things in life, especially marriage. At this point I'm nitpicking, but the non sequitur at the end of your article is something you did all throughout, which is why I'm bringing it up. By find the road with the fewest tire marks and drive down it, I'm inferring that your advice is to pursue the path of least resistance. If you're referring to a spiritual or moral context, I can agree with that. But the way it would most easily be interpreted in the context provided, I disagree with completely. Marriage is hard. Long-term relationships are hard. When you commit to loving someone, it becomes a verb. It is a promise to adapt, to change, and to grow as you and your significant other evolve over the course of your lives together. It is a promise to work diligently to better yourself and to encourage the bettering of your partner. If you don't approach your relationship with your spouse as one that is going to be an enormous undertaking and a major component of both your life and yourself as a person, you're not going to be mentally prepared for the decades of effort you're entering into. Finding the smoothest looking path in order to pursue it is what will most likely leave you flailing and unable to keep your promise in 6.5 years. As I stated at the beginning of this video, I do agree with the sentiment that cohabitation, shacking up, whatever you want to call it, just living together, is definitely a threat to the idea and the culture of marriage and long-term commitment overall. But the problem here is that Matt Walsh is using circular, lazy, contradictory arguments to make this point, and he's clearly far more intelligent than this, and he clearly has a lot more integrity than he is employing in making these points. That's all I wanted to say, just because I read this article and I wanted to scream and turn inside out, because what he's saying here is definitely far less than he's capable of, and it's not sound reasoning. It's just not. So I wanted to point that out, and I hope that I did so in a semi-interesting manner. I also wanted to add the comment that I wrote when I initially read this article on The Blaze. I singled out the fact that he says that there are only a few things that you need to know about your significant other before determining whether you should marry them or not, and that you've got the perceptiveness of a potato or some other, faux, charming, sarcastic, witty remark. And this is what I said in response. Sorry, but you don't truly know someone until you've been with or around them for years. Item 4 on this list worked for you either due to infatuation or because you made some lucky guesses. Getting married to someone right away because they initially appear to meet your criteria is incredibly naive. I'd also like to point out that this romanticization of the past is disingenuous and a dangerous justification. Both of my sets of grandparents stayed married. This was because one grandma relied on her husband for financial stability due to traditional marriage roles and couldn't leave him when he started cheating on her, and because the other grandma came from a background of alcoholism, rape, adultery, and physical abuse and believes that's just how marriages work. As brilliant as you have proven yourself to be through your previous writing, I expect far more logic and sound reasoning from you. And interestingly enough, I got 8 upvotes over the 6 downvotes, which is kind of odd because normally the people on the site are either incapable of reasoning beyond just regurgitating scripture, or they're just yelling about how Glenn is a moron and the Russians didn't do anything wrong. So, kind of getting anybody aligned with what I had to say, which is kind of like a moderate sort of classic liberal stance. I was really surprised at the response I got here. I also got a couple replies from people who are probably like quivering, angry 50-year-old women. That's not fair at all. I have no idea how old they are, what their experiences are. But one person said, I think your comment says far more about the lack of honesty in current generations than it does about the efficacy of cohabitation for turning up a person's faults. The kinds of things that are revealed in living together are very everyday annoyances. They are messy, they leave the toothpaste cap off, etc. If anyone divorces over those reasons, then they are divorcing over some ridiculous reasons, which in no way contradicts what I said, and it's interesting that this person is incapable of coming up with their own examples of those everyday annoyances other than the ones that were literally spoon-fed to them in the article before. So that was one person's response. And in my response to this person, I quoted their phrasing, the lack of honesty in current generations, then went on to say, you're romanticizing past generations in a completely naive way. Read my comment again. I'm directly addressing his claim that you can know everything you need to know about someone after a few months of dating them. Another one of the comments on, or one of the replies to my original comment says, if that is true, then you are surrounded by liars. Someone can spend a good amount of time around me for a few months and they would know me very well. Why? Because I don't believe in manipulating or lying. Which is, I mean, if you are incapable of admitting that you are a liar, there's nothing morally righteous about you whatsoever, and you cannot claim to be attempting to be Christ-like. You cannot claim to be humbling yourself and even endeavoring to be a good person if you can't admit to yourself that you are a liar and you are manipulative. Not to say that there aren't people who wield those things more over others as opposed to people who don't mean to or don't do it as much. But this kind of statement it shows that this person is thinking of themselves as holier than thou, if you will, and they're not being very honest with themselves as far as, integrity and, godliness, which supposedly is very important to Matt Walsh and his fans. Yes, there are exceptions to every rule, and your grandparents were 2 of them, but the point is, be honest with everyone about who you are, including yourself. There have been times that I was not a very good person. Well, I appreciate that. I can see that they said that, so I can't be, I can't be too petty or childish about this. Would I try to act a certain way to get a man I loved? No freaking way. Why? Because I wouldn't want to use him, and if he deserves better than me, I will admit it to myself. We live in a society that lies nearly 100% of the time to ourselves and others. And you are lying to yourself in your answer, but hey, people love justification. So aside from the fact that I'm fairly certain that this individual is implying that I was lying, for example, to my fiance, and I'm lying to him now in order to get him to marry me, despite the fact that we've got everything established the way we want, and despite the fact that I'm trying to justify apparently deceiving the person that I'm with but not married to, and that's what this comment that directly points out the flaws in Matt Walsh's article was in, what my intent was with that. I'm trying to be an adult here, despite the fact that this person is just completely all over the place and incapable of actually focusing on the items that I brought up. So I did my best to get over that and not tear all my hair out. And I responded and said, no, you cannot truly know someone after spending a few months around someone. Whoops, that was redundant. My bad. Psychology dictates otherwise. You have not seen how that person copes with and adapts to difficult situations over time. You haven't seen how that person behaves once they're completely comfortable with you. You can't judge in several months whether someone internalizes their stated morals or not, and you can't see how someone treats their family in several months. The snippet of a person you are able to observe in such a short amount of time does not accurately represent him or her as a human being. And interestingly enough, neither of these people who told me I was wrong, and either intentionally or just out of, being completely ignorant, misconstrued and ignored everything I said, neither of them responded to anything I had to say when I corrected them and tried to steer them back to the actual points I was making. So, not to try to make it seem like everybody on the Blaze, including myself, are a bunch of idiots, but it's hard to have any kind of reasoned dialogue, and I honestly don't really know if that's like a generational thing. It seems like people of the generation that tends to listen to like Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, Glenn Beck, if they can't call you a Democrat or a homophobe or, just parrot the talking points of politicians or just regurgitate scripture without even knowing what it is or comprehending what it's saying enough to rephrase it to fit the argument they're trying to make, you really don't get anything else on this website, which is really unfortunate. But I just wanted to show you guys what my initial response was when I read this article and the kind of replies I got to it on this website. So they're kind of interesting, I guess. So thank you guys for watching. I appreciate it a lot, and please let me know what you guys think as well. I encourage you to read the article yourself, of course. I don't want to have taken anything out of context, and I don't want anybody to, accept my interpretation of what he's saying without investigating it themselves. So I guess I'll see you guys again soon, and I hope you have a good day. Bye. Excuse me. The brass section had some pretty gnarly things stuck in its piping.